Welcome to the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast from Never Too Late Cafe. I'm your host, Laura Womack. Each week, we sit down for a chat with someone just like you, someone who had an idea, a passion, a dream, or sometimes just a thought, and planted that seed, watched it grow into something they wanted to share with the world. If you have an idea for a topic or someone that would be a guest for the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook, where you can join our Never Too Late Cafe Facebook group. We'd love to hear from you. And today I have a special guest with me, Jennifer, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell us a little bit about where she's living currently.
Hey, I'm Jennifer Schomburg Kanke, and I am down in Tallahassee, Florida. I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, lived a lot in Athens, Ohio, and my family's originally from Scioto County, Ohio. So a lot of Ohio connection, but I'm down in Florida now, and I am a poet and fiction writer, sometimes essayist, but mainly poetry and fiction.
Mm. So is that part of what you do? You do some workshops or something in writing?
I do, as as part of trying to outreach to folks, there's a there's a process I use called enrhythming, which is a term I picked up from the poet Annie Finch, which is basically like if you want to write in meter, then you will read something that's in that meter for about 15 minutes. So you're reading it out loud. Like if you're like, oh, I really want to write in dactylic hexameter, then you read Evangeline by Longfellow for like 15 minutes out loud, and then you sit down and just write your poem without really trying to process it too much and just kind of let the rhythm take over you. And so I do some workshops where I introduce people to that concept of enrhythming. And then I also have this other process called the From Mayhem to Meter prompt process, and where we do some prose writing first, then some enrhythming, and then we work on a poem. So it kind of is about putting a little bit of organization to our thoughts.
Well, the reason why I laughed is I don't think I could even pronounce what you were talking about. So obviously, you know a lot about the different methods of doing poetry. Is that something that you've studied a lot in order to be leading groups and doing it yourself?
Yeah, so I have a PhD in English with an emphasis on creative writing poetry. And then, but even going through all that, nobody really talked about meter, like hardly at all. And it wasn't until it was probably like 5 years after I'd finished my degree, I started doing taking some classes with Annie Finch, where I learned how to actually be able to do meter. I never thought I'd be able to do meter before. And I'm like, oh, yeah, this is not quite as hard as I'd kind of built it up to be to myself.
So can you describe what um, doing that meter process is? It's the rhythm, a cadence.
hmm Yeah. Um, I'm like, how would I describe that? That's it. That was
Okay.
a
I've
that's
been
an
known for
interesting.
asking difficult questions, but
I mean, it's a great question though. Um, yeah, it's basically like, have you ever been in did you ever do like marching band in high school or anything like that?
no, I was in choir, but I don't think I could read music all that well. But I've read a lot of Dr. Seuss and kids' books with rhythm.
Okay. Yeah, it's the same thing. I was just gonna I was just gonna liken it that in rhythming is kind of like when we would go out as a marching band, you'd have kind of like a time where you were sort of marking time, where the drums are going and your feet are going, but nobody's really moving or playing or anything yet.
Oh,
Um, and so in rhythming to me is sort of like that. It's like getting your body ready, getting your mind ready, and you're just getting that rhythm going. As a matter of fact, um, some folks, rather than reading a poem out loud to get into a rhythm, they'll beat on a drum or something or dance around to kind of get the rhythm that way instead. So some folks do that.
oh, interesting. I just remember doing a lot of special needs kids childcare, and After a lot of books, I could almost talk and rhyme. It was da 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 da. I'm going to scratch that.
That you were in rhythming. That's exactly what was happening there. You were because you had read the rhythm so much, you were just naturally in rhythming to it. Yeah.
I wonder if people have dreams where that comes to them, because I have friends that say they write and they are poets, and that words just come to them even in their sleep. So if you had people say that, especially if they practice it a lot.
Um, I haven't. I think that's a pretty cool idea though. I'm gonna be mindful of what goes on in my dreams and see if that happens for me.
I wish for a dream in rhythm. That would be cool. So, when did you get so interested in doing this process? So, obviously, you've been a poet for how long?
Um, I think I wrote my first poem that I actually remember writing, probably when I was about 13. So I'm trying to do the math really quick here. I'm just gonna round my age and say so for about 37 years.
Oh, okay. So then, that's about when you got interested in it. What about the rhyming rhythmic part that you decided that you were going to like lead groups or help people learn this process? Was that part of after you got out of school, or you just thought everybody should learn how to do this?
Um, I think that aspect was more once I got out of school and once I started taking Annie's classes in 2020. In like September of 2020, she started offering online classes because with things shut down from the pandemic, all the in-person stuff. So workshops that she was typically only offering to people who could go to wherever she was, which at the time I think was Washington, um, that she could offer them to everybody across the country. And so I was able to start taking them from her. And then after I got into it, I was like, man, when I was younger, so when I was 13 and writing, I was writing in I was writing metrical stuff when I was 13. And I did a lot of sort of writing on my own before I was like uh it was a weird ego thing. I decided to go get a grad degree, right? Like I was looking for somebody to tell me I was a poet. And so before I got in a graduate program for writing, I was also still writing in meter, even sometimes not even realizing it. I look back at those old poems, they were in meter. It was only when I got into a grad program that I stopped. And I think once I got into Annie's classes and realized like, hey, this feels like coming home to me. This feels like I'm back in the a way of writing that I was always meant to be doing. And I'm so frustrated that I lost it for so long. And I realized that one of the reasons I lost it is because people had convinced me that, oh, writing in meter is so hard. That's such a hard thing to do, and you have to be so sort of punctilious about all the, right on. And in working with Annie, I realized there's a thing called allowable metrical substitutions. So you can have a poem that's in iambic pentameter, so like what Shakespeare would write in, but you can slip in a few spondies, which are like just two stresses right next to each other. You can slip in some things where there's like an anapest, which has one more unstressed syllable than iambic. Like you can play around with it a little bit. There's some flexibility. I was so excited to learn that I was like, I want to let people know this, right? Like I want to get this out there.
So you are a rule breaker, or
I
that
well,
it wasn't as strict a rule as what everyone thought it had to be.
yeah, they're so rather than rules, they're guidelines and suggestions.
Mm, yeah.
It's kind of like when you get a cake recipe and you get the recipe and yeah, you got to make sure that you've got all the right bits there so that the science will work in the oven. But if somebody says use cinnamon, but you don't like cinnamon, so you put cardamom in instead, it's, as it still may work. But if you decide you're going to put in I don't know, if all of a sudden you're like, I'm gonna put some paprika in instead of cinnamon, you're gonna end up with a very different cake.
Right.
Um, and so that's like there are allowable things that you can do and some flexibility. Um, and I love it.
Interesting. So Annie was an influence. Were there other influences for you in as from 13 on that you've been writing?
Um, I think I think there have been a lot of influences on my work. And I think one of the biggest influences on my writing has actually been my family's music. That I was in a band with my family, with my father and my mother and a few other people. We played old time music. I played penny whistle. Um, and and I think just being around all that music, being around all those old songs, right? All the
Hmm.
old ballads and stuff like that, it gives you a heightened sense of language. And I don't think I'd be the same poet I am today without having had those experiences with my family.
Interesting. Interesting. So was that in Ohio?
Yeah.
Okay. Was it in Southern Ohio then?
Well, so the band was up in Columbus,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if you remember, this is sort of short-lived, but Shawnee State had a thing called the Appalachian Spring Festival for a little bit in the like mid 90s maybe.
Hmm.
We would come down and play for that. We'd play John Simon Sorghum Festival. We'd come down to play at. So we were down in Southern Ohio a lot for various
I see.
events, but we were based out of Columbus.
Interesting. I didn't even know that you had that music aspect. Um, so I know that you're a published writer as well. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? That's how
Sure,
we
yeah,
met.
yeah, yeah. Because you came to one of the readings that I did. Um, so this is I'm gonna hold this up.
Hmm.
Um, you can see all my tags from where I do readings. My where
And
my
the
favorite
title
poem,
was The Swellest Wife I
the
Ever
s-
Had.
the swellest wife anyone ever had.
Okay.
And it is a book about the life of my grandmother, Enid Schomburg. Um, she grew up in Memphis, Ohio, and then moved to New Boston, Ohio, where she raised her family on Maple Street. And
Hmm.
so it's a collection of poems that follow her life because I wanted her to have her life memorialized because it's not the kind of life that people necessarily put in books often, right?
Mm.
Um there's drama, but there's nothing sort of big momentous dramatic moments. She Her husband goes away to World War II and she's left at home with two young children. She's living on land that's part of his where his family is living, and his family doesn't really like they don't dislike her, but they're not very nice to her. They
Oh,
they're sort of stern people in general in some ways, and they don't like her way of doing domesticity. So it has those daily kind of dramas that we all experience in one way or another.
what a wonderful tribute, a poetic tribute to her life. That's awesome. So, are you on a book tour? I mean, it's recently been out this past year in 2024, correct? Is that when it came out?
Yep, it came out in August of 2024.
Okay. And are you doing somewhat of a book tour?
I'm doing a bit of a truncated book tour. I work a full-time job as I edit documents for the state of Florida. So uh the ability to do like a big book tour, I don't really have that because I only have so many vacation days.
Right.
So I did a small book tour in October where I came up to Ohio and did readings in Athens and Columbus and and in Scioto County in New Boston. Then I've done a couple readings down here in Tallahassee, and I have a some stuff scheduled in Thomasville, Georgia, which is not too far from where I'm at in Tallahassee. So
Really? Georgia? Is that
yeah,
close?
yeah, I'm only depending on depending on how fast you drive and what the traffic is like, I'm 20 minutes from the Georgia border. But
Wow.
if traffic is bad, um it can be about a half hour to get up there, but you can make it in 20.
Wow. Um, how did you end up in Florida?
I I came I came down to the PhD program at Florida State, and the reason that I had gotten into a couple different schools, and I picked Florida because my brother was already living down here in Florida. He lives um kind of closer to Gainesville, but still about half an hour away from Gainesville. He's out in the country. Um, and so to be closer to a school that would let me still be close to family.
Interesting. Um, so do you have other writings that you've had published? Seems like you've had some documents. I don't know what sort of other things that you've had published, but I know that you've had some other things published.
Yeah, I've had a number of poems published over the years. One of the things I'm most proud about is that I have it's called like a micro chapbook or a zine from a press called Rinky Dink Press, and they're poems that I actually wrote while I was in the infusion chair for ovarian cancer. And so they're poems that are just sort of like and they're very short because they have to be able to fit on this like little like 1/8 of a page, like little tiny for each poem. And so they're very short and very just punchy and sort of full of emotion in that little space. And so I'm very proud of that. I have some fiction that's been published too. I won the Sheila Nagig um Editor's Choice Award for fiction. I think that's all the right words in the right order. Um a few years ago for my story A String of Beads, which also takes place in Scioto County, Ohio. It's about a little girl um who um breaks her grandmother's bracelet, and then various other things happen. But as she's trying to, it's a kind of a little coming of age story happening in Portsmouth. So that is
Oh,
out there in the world as well.
more down to earth stories and relatable for people. It sounds really interesting. So, this podcast is called Bloom Where You're Planted. And I asked every guest what that means to them. So, what does it mean to Jennifer?
Um, I think that to me, it very much reminds me of my granny, who the swellest wife anyone ever had is about, because she really did that. It means taking advantage of what comes your way and not focusing on what hasn't come your way.
Hmm,
So it isn't just about blooming where you're planted, but also not lamenting where else you could have been planted.
I see. I see. That's real interesting. Um, and so, since you've done several things, um, and you're very active in the literary world, even with editing documents, that's still, you know, a form of writing. And so, what words of wisdom would you have for someone that would want to do what you're doing or something that you've done in the past?
The wisdom that I would give is the advice I would give is read. If you want to be a writer, you've got to read and be mindful about what you're reading. That if you don't like a book, you don't have to finish reading it. You're allowed to read a chapter of it and say, I don't think this book's for me. Everyone says this is the best book they've ever read. I'm not liking it. I'm going to put it down because anything you read, your brain, your little writer brain is going to suck it in. And so you want to make sure that what's coming in is the stuff that you want your brain to be processing and to come out on your page. And of course, it comes out with you. It's like infused with you when it comes out on the page. So some people get afraid of reading because they say, well, I don't want to be influenced. You do want to be influenced, but you want to be careful about who you're being influenced by, right? Like just get it's like when I was in school, there were some people my mom was like, don't, you're not allowed to hang around with them. Don't hang around that person. They're a bad influence, right? Well, sometimes there's a book that you're like, no, that's a bad influence. That's not what you want to be writing. So read the kind of stuff that you want to be writing and read a lot of it. Um, I think that's kind of my biggest advice for people who want to do what I've done. I think another thing is don't let anybody, don't get bogged down by other people's definition of what you should be or what your writing should look like. Be able to take in people's opinion of it and decide what resonates. Because sometimes people are just like completely off base, or what they want out of a poem is not what you are meant to be writing. For years, I was writing stuff that was not what I was meant to be writing, but it was because I was in these grad programs where people wrote what are called ultra talk poems, which are just very sort of chatty and funny poems. And I was, I was okay. I was okay at them, but and I learned a lot from being in those programs, but I wasn't writing what I was supposed to be writing. Nothing ever felt right, and now it very much feels right.
So it's home for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is next for you? Do you have projects?
I do. I always I have so I'm just always going. I have a book that will come out in 2026. It just got accepted by Sheila Nagig Editions. That is actually they're headquartered out of Russell, Kentucky right now. So I will have a book out called Little Stone, Little Stone. And that book is about women who have been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. So it's poems that I've written that are about celebrities that have had ovarian cancer, but then also writing about my own experiences with the disease. So that will be out in a few years. I'm going to give myself a nice little break between books though to kind of recover from the process of putting this other one together. So I'm excited for that one to come out in I guess that'll be next year because we're in 2025 already. And I'm also working on I have a novel that's in progress, and I've had an excerpt from it that was out in the literary journal Shenandoah, but it's a novel about a woman who becomes a literal goddess after she goes through chemotherapy for ovarian cancer. I might have a theme. I might have some things I'm working through.
Seems like I hear a theme.
Yeah. So I have those, and then I'm also working on a retelling of Longfellow's poem Evangeline, but rather than being set in Nova Scotia, hundreds of years ago, it's set in the Florida Panhandle in the 1980s and 90s mainly. Little bit up into the aughts as well, but a lot in the 80s and 90s.
That's interesting. Very interesting. So how'd you pick that one?
That just kind of came to me. I have a friend who wanted me like when she heard about what I was writing for with poems and stuff about my grandmother, she wanted me to do something similar with her mother, that she wanted her mother's life honored. But her mother's life was a lot rougher in certain ways than my grandmother's life was. And so I played around I tried to write individual poems about her. I tried to write short stories. I just kept trying to find something. And one day I was trying to memorize the poem Evangeline, which is it is a book length poem. It was a ridiculous idea for me to be like, sure. But Annie Finch had said, "Why don't you try to do this?" And I was like, Of course, sure. So I was trying to memorize that poem, and I was down at a place called Alligator Point, and I was on the beach, and I was memorizing Evangeline, and I was saying it out loud, right? Like I was reciting it. Yeah, that's the word, reciting. And then I just started playing around with the words and started talking about the beach, but doing it to the rhythm and kind of sentence structure from Evangeline. And I was like, oh, this is it. This is the idea. This is what I need to do with this person's story. Um, I'm gonna do this retelling. It's been, I think it's been a year since I started, a little bit over a year since I started actually working on that aspect of it and finally getting into that form. And I'm getting near the end, but it's hard to do. Like meter can be, it can be easy, but also it can take some time and effort.
Well, you said it was quite a lengthy poem, too.
Yes.
I really thank you so much for being a guest. Um, any final words? I guess I could call you Dr. Jennifer.
I mean, yeah, you can, I don't tend to, even when I taught college for many years, and my students just called me JSK.
Oh,
So
okay.
it was, I never really stood on the formality. I know there are some people who say they want to be called doctor because they worked long and hard for that. Like, I worked long and hard for a lot of things in my life, and so yeah, I'm fine without the doctor for sure. I think maybe I think one thing that I want to leave people with is the idea that you should find what works right for you. That there's no one size fits all in writing, and you have to find the community that works for you and the books to read that's going to work for you. And nobody else can tell you what that is. People can point you towards something, but you're going to know what's right.
Those are very good words. I've had writer friends that have been brutalized by writing groups and things like that. And I'm like, that's just not your group.
Yeah.
So as our time comes to a close, remember to keep creating, keep sharing, and keep supporting each other. And remember to bloom where you're planted. Bye for now.